very distinguished guest, Dr. Robert Kagan, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of very many books, but one in particular that we're going to hear about today, which is called The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. And Dr. Kagan is as experienced as anyone in the analysis of American foreign policy, in part because he's written a wide number of books on the topic, also because he worked in the U.S. government during the 1980s, and his writings span a very wide variety of topics, from U.S.-Nicaraguan relations to the history of American foreign policy in the 19th century to many pressing issues today. So I'm very pleased to hear Dr. Kagan talk about the jungle and the ways it is growing back. So he's going to give us some thoughts on American foreign policy today, and then take your questions after that. So I encourage you to give some good questions and pose them to him once he's done explaining the jungle to us. So Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here to talk foreign policy. I realize some of you are here under duress, and the rest of you are here for the food, but I still appreciate it, so thank you. I think it's going to be obvious to you. I think it's pretty much obvious to all that in terms of the United States and its role in the world, we're having a big debate in this country. It's not, in some respects, the kind of overt debate that I think we should be having, but you can see in the electoral results and in some of the things that the candidates say and are running on that we really are re-examining. I think Americans for quite some time have been asking questions about the role the United States has played in the world since the end of the Second World War. And I think if you look at the last election cycle, the 2016 election, there were four major political figures on the scene. Three of them, one of them was the president, Barack Obama, and was on his way out, but was still obviously a major figure on the scene. And then the three major candidates, one obviously Donald Trump, and then Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And I would say of those four figures, only one of them really stood for continuity in American foreign policy going back to the end of the Second World War, that sort of bipartisan foreign policy consensus. Ben Rhodes called it the blob, that sort of America, the indispensable nation approach. Whereas I would say certainly Trump and Bernie Sanders were arguing for a more constrained American role and a different attitude towards what we commonly call, for lack of a better phrase, and I wish there were a better phrase, the liberal world order. On both the progressive side of the Democratic Party and the Trump side of the Republican Party, which is now most of the Republican Party, there's a lot of criticism of the liberal world order as being a bad deal for Americans. And that, I think, was a majority view in the last election, if you look at the Trump and the Sanders vote. And to the degree that Clinton stood for something else, I think it hurt her politically. And she even had to repudiate her own support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a deal, an agreement that she had an awful lot to do with negotiating and would, in normal circumstances, have been one of the hallmarks of her Secretary of State ship, and she had to repudiate. So I think that gives an indication of the kind of mood that the American people certainly were in 2016. And when I see President Trump conducting a policy which he calls America First, it certainly upsets the bipartisan foreign policy establishment and what we call the elites in the sort of northeastern corridor. But I'm not sure the American people have any objection to that concept. And I think, in fact, many of them say, yeah, that's right. It ought to be about America first. So, but I think we've sort of slid into this without really sort of struggling over it. And I think one of the reasons for that is I don't think people remember why we ever took on this task of supporting a liberal world order in the first place. We don't think back very far. Americans are famously not interested in history. But in any case, there's very little memory and very little understanding. And so I wrote this book, The Jungle Grows Back. And if you read it, it's a short book. It won't take you very long. Your professor should sign it because you'll be delighted to have such a short book to have to read. But a lot of it is history. A lot of it is going back to answering the question, how did we ever adopt this role in the first place? And there's a couple of, I think, very widespread misconceptions about the liberal world order, which I think distort our understanding of what we were doing and what we might continue doing now. One of those misconceptions is that the liberal order and America, this is sort of America, the indispensable nation approach to the world, was created in response to the Cold War and the Soviet Union. As a historical matter, that's not the case. The ideas, the vision, and in many respects, the sort of core elements of this liberal world order came into being during World War II and immediately following the end of World War II, before American leaders thought the Soviet Union was going to be an adversary. As you know, during World War II, the Soviets were an ally, and most assumed, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dean Acheson, George Marshall, George Kennan, all the people who played such a big role in shaping the international system, all believed the Soviet Union was going to continue to be an ally, or at least a partner in maintaining peace after the war was over. So the order was not created in response to the Cold War. It actually was created in response to what had already happened. And that's the way statesmen generally are. They're not, most foreign policy ideas or strategies are not forward-looking. They tend to be backward-looking. They're trying to prevent the last catastrophe. And so the generation that established this liberal order were trying to prevent what they had just lived through, which was 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the Ukrainian famine, all the horrors of the first half or the first 40 plus years of the 20th century. And so when they set out to create something after World War II, they looked back and they said, these were the factors that contributed to these catastrophes, and these are the factors that we have to guard against. And that gets to the sort of second misconception about the liberal world order. I think people associate it with a very idealistic view of shaping the world and shaping humanity. People use the term Wilsonianism. I don't particularly think, I think that's a mistreatment of poor Woodrow Wilson, but in any case, that's the way we use the word, that it was, it was a kind of a dreamy, idealistic approach, when in fact, the people who constructed the liberal world order were deeply pessimistic about human beings and the international system, and obviously for good reason, given what they had just lived through and witnessed. And so the order they set up was not to create some kind of heaven on earth. It was to prevent hell from returning to earth. And that's important because I think sometimes people look at the liberal world order and say it's just pure idealism. It's not about anything real. My argument is that their creation of this order was an act of realism, and particularly realism about the nature of humanity, the dark elements that exist, and the nature of the international system. And in this respect, they were very much like the founders of the American Republic, who also had a pessimistic view of human nature, assumed that people would be selfish, ambitious, and not always particularly nice to each other, and set up a system which would contain and channel those sort of negative qualities of human nature in such a way as to produce actually a good outcome. We can decide these days whether that's still working or not, but that was certainly the plan. So as it happens, this very realistic, pragmatic, and even rather pessimistic approach to the world ended up creating a rather extraordinary set of international and domestic circumstances. And that's the third sort of misconception that I think we suffer from today. we look at the liberal world order, I know that on college campuses and in areas of Trump support, the liberal world order has a bad name. It's either regarded as a form of hegemony, it's produced inequality, or it has robbed Americans of jobs, through globalization and bad trade deals, etc. All of those things that get associated with the liberal world order. And and academics have been writing recently that, let's not forget about Vietnam and McCarthyism, so let's not celebrate too much American foreign policy that, in service of this liberal world order throughout the Cold War and beyond. And of course, people look at the last 25 to 30 years and they see Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's this general consensus that this has been a failure, a failed policy, a failed approach to the world, which is one reason I think many are eager to jettison it in favor of something else. Now, of course, they can't quite say what that something else is. That's one of my complaints with even the academics. They go through a long discussion of what's wrong with liberal world order, and then say at the end, and so we need fresh thinking. And that's the end of the article. So I'm waiting for the fresh thinking. So I'm not here to say that liberal order is a perfectly wonderful thing. It has been flawed. There has been continuing violence. There have been genocides. There have been wars. There is inequality. There is unfairness. The liberal order is a form of hegemony. It's an hegemony of ideas and power. It is an imposition. It is not democratically chosen by everyone around the world. I could actually spend the rest of our time here listing all the problems with the liberal world order. It is not what we would like it to be, and I think it's good for us to want to make it better and to improve on it. But I also think it is a big mistake and possibly a dangerous mistake to take for granted those elements of the liberal order that are truly extraordinary and have made this period in history unique and uniquely beneficial. I think it's too easy to take everything for granted and only focus on the negatives. And what I would like to do, in addition to thinking about what the liberal order could be, is not only compare it to an ideal, but to compare it to what has always been. To compare it to what life in the real world for human beings has been throughout recorded history. And if you do look at it from the perspective of comparing it to what has actually been, you do see that it's been, I think, really has been an extraordinary period. And I look at three fundamental elements of that, of the unique qualities of this period. One is prosperity. If you look at, as far as we're able to tell, that the economic historians can measure let's say, global GDP growth throughout history. Well, if I asked you what was global GDP growth 1,000 years ago, annual GDP growth 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, what would you say? I mean, I'll answer for you. Zero. There was no growth. There was no prosperity. The 99.999% of all human beings throughout history, throughout recorded history, and I'm sure before, lived in a state of abject poverty. And only the tiniest fraction of rulers and families enjoyed any kind of wealth at all. And that began to change really only with the early Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when we began to see something like global GDP growth on an annual basis, and I think economic historians measure it at roughly 1 to 1.5% annual growth. And of course, that growth took place only within, such growth as there was, took place only within the transatlantic space, the nations that were industrializing at that time. No one else was enjoying any of that growth, and the empires that were created then brought wealth to the imperial home, but it did not create wealth in the colonies for the people who were doing the work. Well, since 1945, since just after World War II, global annual annual GDP growth has been over 4%. And when we're talking about billions and millions of people, that's a really extraordinary number. And again, compared to 0 or compared to 1 or 1.5 or 2% in the past. And of course, as we've also seen, that growth has taken place more outside the transatlantic space than inside the transatlantic space. And so we've seen people, working and becoming, having more money, having a higher standard of living, obviously in China, in India, and elsewhere, which is an entirely new phenomenon as far as global history is concerned. And during this period, something like 4 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, or I should say lifted themselves out of poverty, and now we are living in an age where the middle class in the world is as large as it's ever been. However you want to measure the middle class, but it's not, we're talking about people who have escaped poverty, billions of people. And this is really, this is a revolution in terms of human, in terms of what's been the norm for human beings. Also, equally obvious has been the growth of democracy in this period. Democracy was the rarest form of government throughout history. It was so rare that it was really almost an accident. There was no trend toward democracy, even as late as the middle of the 19th century, and whatever trend there was at the end of the 19th century meant going from 5 to 10 democracies in the world. And so today, we have over 100 democracies. It got up to about 115 at one point, it's down to 110, but we're still talking about an explosion of democracy that's unlike any other time in history. Most people, the vast majority, 99.9% of all humans who've ever lived, have lived under one or another form of tyranny. And so that's an extraordinary change. It's an extraordinary element of this period. And then finally, we've seen a period, it's not an incredibly long time, but it's just longer than has ever been before, a period of peace among the great powers. If you think about European history, going back as far as anyone can remember, and I'm sure this is true if you look at other parts of the world as well, there's practically not a year when there wasn't some kind of conflict going on among the great powers. And some of these conflicts were truly cataclysmic. And we think of World War I and World War II and the damage that they caused. But of course, there's also the Napoleonic War and the damage and the effect it had on Europe and on the population of Europe. And there was the 30 Years' War, which decimated much of Central Europe, and you can go back as far as you want to. There's nothing that's been more normal than war among whoever the great powers were, the city-states, the empires, and what have you. And so during this period, since World War II, we've had wars, the United States has participated in wars, but we haven't had the kind of cataclysmic war that we saw in the first half of the 20th century, which has such devastating effect on not just the participants, but on everybody else on the planet. So I would say any single one of these three things would have made this a unique period. When you bring them all together, it makes it a truly unique period. And so I would just have to say that whatever the many flaws of the liberal world order, let's not lose sight of this extraordinary accomplishment. And of course, I think we do lose sight of it. In fact, in a way, the liberal order has been too successful, because it's been successful in a way as to convince people that it sort of had to be, and we can't imagine any other kind of world. We can't imagine a world that is not like the one that we've enjoyed. And we even came up with all kinds of theories about how this world had to evolve this way, and that this is all a product of inevitable evolution, the inevitable development of the species. This is a very common, we're all sort of children of the Enlightenment, and this is the Enlightenment conceit, that there is such a thing as progress, and not just technological and scientific progress, not just progress in the acquisition of knowledge, which is undeniable, but accompanying that, and I think a lot of Enlightenment philosophers would have said, because of that, Also, progress in terms of human behavior, in terms of morality, in terms of the way people treat each other and want to live. And so we've had all kinds of versions of this theory that what we've been enjoying today is a natural evolution. So if you think back on Frank Fukuyama's famous essay after the end of the Cold War, The End of History, the argument, sort of borrowing from Hegel as modified by Kojève, for those of you who are keeping score at home, was that the better idea won in a dialectical battle of ideas, right? So there was authoritarianism, and there was fascism, and there was communism, and there was liberal democracy, and they kind of fought it out over the centuries, and liberal democracy won because it worked better. And so that was kind of inevitable, and nothing to do with sort of events in a way. It was the struggle of ideas. Even today, if you read the works of Steven Pinker, he writes about how he documents in incredible and admirable detail how much better human beings are behaving today than they were in the past, and not just in terms of reduction of deaths from wars, but also reduction in violence committed by human beings against each other. And his answer to why that is so is that the Enlightenment ideals have really taken hold of human beings, and so they've learned, how to behave in a better way. Or if you read the book of this two Yale law professors about the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, they argue that although you had the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 and then you had this whole World War thing, nevertheless, now the ideas embodied, the idea of outlawing war, the idea that war is immoral has finally taken hold, and that explains why we haven't had these wars. So you probably can tell from my tone that I don't really find these things very plausible. I find it hard to believe that whereas 80 years ago, in the lifetimes of our parents and our grandparents, we saw Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and the Holocaust and the most destructive wars imaginable and man-made famines that killed tens of millions, etc., etc. And that was 80 years ago. But in 80 years, we now have undergone a complete change in our behavior as human beings. That these Enlightenment ideas that Pinker talks about were promulgated 300 and 400 years ago, but did not prevent all the horrors of those 300 and 400 years, but now they have taken hold. Or, if my question is, if the liberal democratic idea was better, why did it only win after 1989? Why didn't it win in 1939? When in fact, if you've been sitting around in 1939, the last thing anyone would have said in 1939 is, I think the liberal democratic idea is just about to win. Because the truth is, people had pretty much given up on democracy by that time. So I think we have to look elsewhere for explanations, and as a historian, I'm inclined not to look at big theories, but to look at contingent events. And the contingent event that I argue, and this is sort of the argument in this book and some of the past books that I've worked on, is that what we had after the end of World War II was a unique situation. You had a new, very powerful nation that was the primary victor in a war that had destroyed everybody else. That power happened to be a liberal power itself, whose very birth was based on an Enlightenment concept, the Declaration of Independence. And when it set out to create a new international system, that international system, not surprisingly, reflected the preferences and predilections of that power, just as all previous orders have always reflected the preferences and predilections of those powers. So the order that was established by the European great powers after the Napoleonic War was an aristocratic, monarchic order designed to preserve monarchy and aristocracy. The Roman order was designed to preserve Rome's way of looking at the world. And you could go on and look at every one of these orders. So how shocking is it that the American-dominated order has had these qualities? And the other thing, it seems to me, that if you look at the great sweep of history and you look at this order and think about all the unique elements of this period, I think it only in a kind of enlightenment delusion could you imagine that what this is about is a sign that we've reached a new plateau, rather than view it, I'm afraid, more pessimistically the way I think the founders of the order did, and realize that this is almost certainly an aberration. That if you look at all of history, this is the odd period out, so to speak. These 75 years are unlike any other 75 years in history, and that should not lead us to assume that this is the new normal, but that this is probably very fragile and not likely to last. And that's why I turn to this, this metaphor of a garden and a jungle. And if you think about a garden and a jungle, and by jungle I mean the weeds and vines. If you're a gardener, I'm not a gardener, but probably some of you are gardeners. I understand the principle of a garden. And the principle of a garden, as I understand it, is that, first of all, a garden is an artificial creation. It's made by humans. It doesn't form naturally. And it's made by sort of pushing out the weeds and the vines and cultivating the earth and planting and then growing things by choice. And the one thing you know, I understand, if you're a gardener, is that you don't just plant your garden, fold your arms, and walk away, and assume that if you come back in a week, you're still going to have a garden. Because, of course, there are constant forces of nature. By the way, they're not evil. Weeds are not evil. Vines are not evil. But they are constantly seeking to reclaim the land. And so a garden needs to be constantly tended. And the vines and the weeds need to be pulled and cut and pushed back. And that's the way I view the liberal world order. It is also artificial, it is also tenuous, and it will also be run over and undermined by the weeds and the vines if allowed. Now, what are the weeds and the vines in that analogy? By the way, every time I start doing these metaphors, I get in trouble. You're going to be thinking about but what about this kind of weed and that kind of weed? So I'm ready for that. It'll happen, and it's okay. But bear with me for just a second longer. You know, the weeds and the vines, as I see it, are natural forces that tend to undermine the liberal world order. One of those is the natural tendency of international relations. The natural tendency of international relations is not toward order, it is toward chaos and conflict. If you want to say what is natural, the world in 1939 is natural. That's where things were leading until World War came, and then we sent things in a different trajectory. No one living in 1939 would have said, I don't know how this happened. They saw how it was happening. So the international system tends toward chaos and conflict unless an effort is made to establish some kind of order. And that is done with power and hegemony. Because without power and hegemony, you can't impose any kind of order. Now, an order can be good from our point of view, or it can be bad, but it nevertheless needs to be imposed. The second major element of the jungle, the weeds and the vines, is human nature itself. I think we have gotten used to the idea that all things being equal, certain elements of human nature will predominate, and we wanted to believe that the elements of human nature that would predominate were the things that Frank Fukuyama identified in his essay: the desire for recognition, the desire for dignity, which ultimately meant individual rights being protected against government. That's what liberalism is, by the way. When you talk about a liberal order, what does that mean? It means that the focus is on individual rights, not the rights of the government. And that differentiates it from, let's say, the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm, which elevated the state above the individual. The people, this was a belief that people needed to subordinate themselves to the interests of the common good as represented by the state. Liberalism has the opposite idea. It's
the idea that the state exists only to serve to protect individual rights, okay? But that is only one element of human aspiration. I think we all know that human nature has the better angels, as Lincoln called them, but also the darker angels. So human nature is about love, but it's also about hate. It's about selflessness, but it's also about selfishness. And in the area of sort of political organization, yes, there are always existing human desires, and I would say it's true of all humans, regardless of where they live or what their traditions are. There are always human desires for the sanctity of their own rights, the desire for freedom, the desire to make their own choices, which is sort of the underpinning of democratic government. But at the same time, the opposite impulses also exist. Humans crave security, and they crave the security of family and tribe and nation. They aren't inclined by nature all the time to think that all humans are created equal and that I should treat all humans as if they were equal. They treat their own family as if it's more equal. They treat their tribe as if it's more equal. And especially at times when people feel insecure, they cling to family and tribe. It's it's the most natural human response. And it's also true that humans don't always seek freedom. Sometimes they seek a strong ruler who can tell them what to do. And again, that is also something that comes from feelings of insecurity, in a sense that they don't know how to protect themselves and they want to give someone power to protect them and protect their culture and their tribe and nation. And that is always at work. There's a constant struggle in all humans between these competing desires and needs and sort of the essences of humanity. So when we see today in Europe, for instance, a return, much to everyone's surprise, of nationalism and tribalism, or even if we see it here in the United States, we can ask reasonably enough, well, what did we do that created this? And you can come up with explanations. Maybe it was economic inequality, maybe it was immigration that people thought was out of control, and all these elements are there. But we also must just realize that, well, this is just always there. And you can either let it run wild, or you can find ways to channel and suppress it. And that's what the American experiment has been, to a large extent, is suppressing some of this. And that is what the experiment in Europe has been since World War II. It doesn't have to always work, and especially if we stop trying to contain and suppress it. So as I look around the world today, what I see are the weeds and the vines growing back, as they were inevitably going to, just because they do anyway, but especially if we have stopped trying to resist them. And I think, I can look at specific instances of things that are happening today that are at least partly the result of the fact that the keepers of the order have stopped gardening. And honestly, when I see a Saudi crown prince order the kind of hit that Mohammed bin Salman ordered in the way that he did it, to me that's a sign of someone believing that there's not going to be a cost to taking that kind of action. And by the way, we're going to find out whether there is a cost. And if there isn't a cost to that, and if there isn't a cost to similar actions around the world, we will gradually see more of it. And let me just end this discussion by talking about, how quickly, how suddenly things can fall apart. If we had been, because I think that's another thing that Americans in particular have forgotten. I think there's a general assumption that the United States could significantly retract the role that it has been playing since World War II, and the world will stay roughly the same. In fact, I think many people hope it'll be better for us somehow. So they kind of think everything stays the same except we get a bigger piece of the pie. And that seems to me to be false, but it also indicates, in a sense, a lack of understanding about how things can go, how much worse things can get than they imagine, and how quickly. So if we were sitting here in 1925, just to take a not entirely random date, we would have looked around the world and we would have seen a struggling but nevertheless successful democracy in Germany. We would have seen a relatively successful democratization in Japan. We would have seen the spirit of Locarno breaking out in Europe, an agreement between France and Germany, which would seem to be betokening a new era. If we made it to 1928, we would have seen the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawing war. And we would have been living in an American economy that was roaring and booming as it had never done at any other time in its history. Within 6, 7, 8 years, that world had been completely turned upside down. You had the Japanese intervention in Manchuria in 1931. Hitler comes to power in 1933. Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. And I think you guys know how the rest of that plays out. In 10 years, the world completely changed because even though 1925 felt like it was a good year, the basic underpinnings of world order were gone. There was no country taking responsibility for maintaining world order, and therefore it was like the cartoon character that's run past the mountain and is still running in midair. It was just a matter of time before the fall comes. I use a quotation that I like a lot from Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises. A character in that novel is asked, he went bankrupt. And so his friends asked him, how did you go bankrupt? And his answer is gradually and then suddenly. And that's the way world orders collapse. We don't know exactly when it'll happen. We don't know what the precipitating event is. But when it happens very quickly. Now, I'm going to end on what little optimism I have been able to muster, which is that the order is in fact incredibly durable. The system that the United States set up, the alliance structures, the fact that, and this was the core of the order, was the conversion of Germany and Japan from two aggressive dictatorships to two Pacific economic powerhouses. That still remains in place, and all that came from that. The structure of the international system still favors those alliances because any potential rising power, whether it's China or a strenuous power like Russia, still faces a pretty strong phalanx of fairly wealthy democratic countries in their way. And so I actually think that if we chose to maintain this system, it would continue to be costly. We would still make the mistakes that we make. And I haven't discussed that as much as I can when we do Q&A. But it is a manageable effort, it seems to me. The real danger to the order is not anything intrinsic and material in the international system. The danger is the decision by those who have been maintaining the order that they don't feel like doing it anymore, which is sort of, I think, where the American public is headed these days, and led by their president in that direction as well. So, I think, like everything else that I'm talking about, I'm not a determinist. I didn't think democracy had won, and I don't think democracy has lost. I didn't think peace had broken out for all time, and I don't think we're doomed to international war of the kind we've seen before. I don't think America is doomed to fail, but I also don't think it's predetermined to succeed. And so we all have to struggle. At the end of the day, this is not about forces of history and arcs of justice or any of those things. It's about individual humans struggling with their demons and with everyone's demons and trying to keep the weeds in our minds at bay. So on that, let me end, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Rocky White's Tertiary American Studies here at the Fletcher School. How do you think the role of nuclear weapons plays in the multipolar world or the multi-nuclear world? Does it stabilize or not? Or what are your thoughts as somebody who's thought a lot about this topic?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and of course, it is the explanation that some give for the peace that we've enjoyed between the great powers, particularly between among the nuclear powers. I have to say that I'm skeptical of that argument. I also find it somewhat ironic that during the Cold War, we were in a constant panic that we were always one step away from nuclear conflict, and I spent my childhood playing in a fallout shelter that was dug by our neighbors, in 1962. No one, remember well, you probably know we're all too young, but there was something called the Doomsday Clock, which, I don't know, was it the bulletin of the atomic scientists? Used to move the hand closer to midnight, etc., all throughout the Cold War. I was told that young people in the 1980s were traumatized at the prospect of nuclear, etc., etc. Now, all of a sudden, we're saying, thank God for nuclear weapons. I think we were right the first time. And I think that it's very foolish to bet against nations ultimately using whatever weapons they have available. Certainly anyone who made that bet before World War I and World War II lost. So I don't count on nuclear weapons. Now, the other thing I would say is, I actually also believe that great powers can have a sub-nuclear conventional war without the intention of going nuclear. Now, of course, sometimes your intentions, things get out of hand, but right now, I would say every single day, the American military and the Chinese military plan on a conventional war that does not go nuclear. So I don't think it prevents conventional war, and I wouldn't bet on nuclear weapons never being used again. So the argument by one of the sort of great professor, John Mearsheimer, that if you really want peace, you'll arm every nation in the world with nuclear weapons. I'm really not down with that, because I think what that proliferation suggests is an increased likelihood that they'll be used. And just one final word. Right now, I think the reason we haven't had war has been the near monopoly of power enjoyed by the United States. If we move back to a normal, multipolar, competitive world in which all the competing nations have nuclear weapons, I don't want to put my money on that also never getting out of hand. That's a good question, thank you. Yes?
Hi, my name is Amanda Schwartz. I'm a first-year law student here. So this metaphor of the jungle seems to imply that the garden or the liberal world order is the ideal,
Right.
especially as we're losing that these days. It becomes, this beacon of light in our minds. So I think you could also make the argument that a world order that requires so much maintenance and that can be weakened or even toppled by just one or a few elections or events, dominoes falling down, is not the ideal. So can you make an argument for why, in favor or opposed to this ideal, or is there a better system that we should be aiming for instead that doesn't require this maintenance and pruning?
Yeah, right, and that's a great question, and it's something that, I get asked a lot. And my answer is, I'm wide open. Tell me what that is. And I think, we can, in our, theoretically imagine a world where, you have, let's say, a UN structure that actually, determines what nations do. You can have a more democratic system of nations determining, what should be done and what shouldn't be done. The only thing I'm prepared to say is, this is the best system that we've seen, and I don't know what the real alternative is. I know what a series of ideal alternatives could be, but in the real world, I don't know what the alternatives are. And I must say, I've had this discussion with lots of people. I think I mentioned in my remarks that you can go online and find a number of articles recently, especially making the point that you're making, which is what's so great about this liberal world order. Graham Allison wrote a piece about that the liberal world order is a myth, that there was no such thing as a liberal order. And I could name you any number of other professors who've written articles saying it, and there was a lot of violence, and it was fragile, etc., all the things you said. And so I read these articles, and I get down, and I'm waiting for them to say, answer your question. And I get down to the bottom of the article, and then they all say, so what we need is some fresh thinking. What we need is to think hard about how to come up with a better order. And I'm like, I'm all for that. Could you please do that? And I'm sort of stunned at how little thought, there's plenty of thought gone into what's wrong with the system that we've got. There's very little thought genuinely about what the alternative is. So I'm not saying there isn't one, I'm just waiting to be told what it is. And I think one of the reasons people don't go there is because the obvious answers are things that have already been tried and have failed, or things that were never tried because it was inconceivable to try them. World government, a real League of Nations, a real United Nations, as some more idealistic aspirations for it. So that's my problem. It's not that you're wrong to comment on how fragile it is and to say, therefore, couldn't we do better? It's just to say, what does doing better mean? So there's a job for you, okay? What's your next task? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Zach Christo, and I work in Fletcher's Office of Executive Education, also a Fletcher grad. I was wondering if you can pinpoint at what time did the garden stop being intended? When did that start to happen? And maybe on a related note, Walter Russell Mead had an op-ed the other day saying Trump is no isolationist. He's actually interventionist, global, and aggressive. So I was wondering, what is your take on that? If in fact the garden has stopped being tended now, Mead is saying it hasn't been, just being tended differently. Wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Those are both really good questions, and you know, the honest answer is there have always been times throughout the system. I feel like such an idiot creating this metaphor that I have to let now live in, but it was a good title for a book, that's all. I couldn't get away from it. You know, ever since the order was created, there have been numerous times when it was not being tended to. So, if you look at the Cold War, you know, particularly during the Vietnam War, there were a lot of things happening in the world that no one was trying to prevent because the United States was distracted. So, for instance, you know, the '73 war in the Middle East, there was nothing inevitable about that war, and I think a more attentive, you know, America and Europe could have prevented it and sort of sat on it. So you can look at a lot of things that happened all through the Cold War and say, that is the garden not being tended. So in terms of the trend, though, I think that the beginning of doubts in the United States about the need even to play this role begin pretty much the day the Berlin Wall falls. That so many Americans were under the impression, and not just of average Americans, but American intellectuals and leaders, that since the liberal order they thought was created to deal with the Soviet Union, and since America had taken on this vast and abnormal role because of the Soviet Union, now that the Soviet Union was no more, we could stop doing that. In fact, Gene Kirkpatrick, who was this big, big Cold War hawk, wrote in 1990 that it was time, now that the Soviet Union was gone, America should go back to being a normal nation. Because of course we have not been playing a normal role in the past. So I would start to say that while in a way I think successive American presidents and administrations, this blob, continue to try to play this role. George H.W. Bush driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, in 1991. Bill Clinton sending forces to contain the disaster in Bosnia and then later using force in Kosovo. I think these were all efforts to try to keep a lid on the worst elements of things and then not doing it in Rwanda and failing to do it in Somalia. So it was a mixed picture, but these were efforts. But the American public support for these efforts was declining consistently. So that, and then when Iraq went south and Afghanistan didn't work out the way people expected or hoped, then the bottom kind of fell out. But the trend was already in place. So that's the long-term trend. And so I don't blame, Donald Trump is a symptom of this trend, not the creator of it. And I actually see a lot of continuity between the Obama administration's policies and the Trump administration's policies. Both of them, their heads explode whenever you say that, obviously. But I think that what you see is more continuity than anything. So let me just answer the Walter Mead point. I also don't think Trump is an isolationist. By the way, my argument, if you go back and, don't have to, go back and read the volume I wrote on America from its pre-birth to the end of the 19th century, is that I don't believe America's ever isolationist. You know, we're too deeply involved in the world through trade, our universal ideology, our power. The real question is not isolationism versus internationalism. The real question is global responsibility versus self-interest, and narrowly determined. Trump wants to shed global responsibility and use American power to accomplish American goals. So you look at the trade regime, and instead of thinking we need to support a free trade regime, because that's what the founders of the org said was necessary to prevent backsliding to the 2 world wars, you say, I'm not interested in free trade regime, I'm interested in maxing out on the number of dollars that we get in trade deals. Or you look at the Middle East, like you look at Syria, for instance, and you could say, well, Syria is a world order problem, and the fact that we allowed Syria to get out of hand, that created 2 million refugees which poured into Europe and then destabilized European politics. Or you could say, our problem is ISIS, because ISIS are the ones who want to kill us. Syria is not our problem, ISIS is our problem. That's the distinction. It's not isolationism, it's basically saying, it is America first. It's normal behavior. What's in it for us? Who can hurt us? Where can we get our money? That's our policy. Now, it's interesting when you have a country as powerful as the United States saying, we're going to use this enormous power for us. Whereas in the past, we've been using it for us, but we also were using it in the interest of this sort of collective well-being on the theory that that was also ultimately for us, but in a very kind of far-sighted way. Yes?
I'm interested in what you think about the rise of NGO culture and like whether you think it's a positive that so many non-government actors are helping with the gardening, so to speak, and doing things that government used to do or used to be expected to do, or do you think that's a source of the rise in mistrust in government?
Actually, both could be true, but I do think that the rise of NGOs is a good thing, because I think that they, almost by definition, are concerned with the garden. I think what I've learned in my own experience, I'm part of NGO, but just like, trying to get the administration not to support dictatorships in Egypt or something. It's very hard for NGOs to accomplish things that states don't want to do. There was a time, I think, when people thought that these kinds of transnational institutions would gradually gain power at the expense of the state. But unfortunately, or I won't say unfortunately, but certainly as a pragmatic matter, states have retained their power. And all the NGOs in the world can't undo the decisions that states make. So I believe that NGOs are a force for good, but whether they're effective really depends on their ability to persuade states to take necessary action. Now that's not true of Doctors Without Frontiers and other things where people are actually in this no man's land where states are not doing anything. That's important, but that's a pretty rare activity. Elsewhere, they depend on states to provide security and capability to accomplish their objectives. Yeah.
Sir, it's from Paul, my name is Chris from the Institute. First, do you think that capitalism and free markets is an essential part of the global world order? And as a follow-up to that, do you look at numerous states transitioning to or adopting certain parts of socialism and democratic socialism? Do you look at that as maybe an example of the weeds coming back, or do you look at that as maybe a transition in your international liberal order?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that it's a core part of liberalism if you go back to Locke, and this is certainly what the founders of the American Republic believed, is that you can't have individual rights unless you have proper, the individuals have the right to own their own property and not have it taken away from them at the whim of the government. So private property is a core element of it, and then the sort of building blocks. I mean, capitalism can exist obviously without liberalism, and has, but historically the two are so tightly intertwined that you can't imagine liberalism in a world where you've stamped out capitalism, because you would be limiting people's right to trade their money, use it, invest it, gamble with it, etc., all the things that make capitalism work. So I can imagine capitalism without liberalism, but I can't imagine liberalism without capitalism. Now, in terms of what governments are doing now, I mean, the assumption was that you couldn't imagine successful capitalism without liberalism, and therefore, countries like China, to take the most obvious example, in order to succeed in the international economic system and continue to succeed, they had to liberalize politically. And I think what we're discovering and have discovered is that that's not necessarily true. That they can have this kind of hybrid economy that is basically state capitalism and still produce sufficient wealth and power to make them without having to liberalize at all. Because if anything, China's moved in the opposite direction from liberalization. They've now consolidated capitalism. What is it?
They're doing group work.
Pardon?
They're doing group work because there's no use in this book.
Oh.
You waited to collapse in here.
I'm waiting for the ceiling to come down. And so the way that relates to the sort of second half of your question is, autocracy is authoritarianism and autocracy are natural forms of government. They're very organic, and they are not. We had this hope and expectation that they would gradually fade away because of their inability to compete in the capitalist framework. I think we just tremendously underestimated the degree to which people are willing to live under authoritarian governments if they have some kind of ability to have any kind of decent living. And so basically the Russian government and the Chinese government made a bargain with their people that said you can get rich and shop. And I mean, the Chinese fulfilled this bargain better than the Russians have, but just keep your nose out of politics. And that's a deal that a lot of people are willing to make at various different times. So in a sense, yes, that authoritarianism and autocracy are part of the natural order, and our expectation that they would wither away on their own, I think, has just proven to be mistaken. It probably should have been understood always to be mistaken. And in fact, if any system of government is more natural or less natural, democracy seems to be less natural. Autocracy and authoritarianism seems to be more natural. Communism was even less natural than democracy, which I think is why ultimately it failed. But so yes, I think the answer to your question is yes.
One more question.
One more question? Yeah. Okay, yes.
Hi, sir. My name is Melanie Barlow. I'm a first year. My question is, would you agree with the premise that to the extent the liberal world order has worked, that it was based on norms of behavior? And secondly, if you agree with that premise, what do we have to fear from new ways of warfare, specifically cyber and information warfare, where there are not these rules of engagement established, or is that more of an overblown current fear?
I mean, I would separate out that question because I don't think that there was the evolution of new norms followed the imposition of the order by power. And so, it's not as if, you had to have the sort of military victories in order to have the new norms evolve, because, norms are, again, I just want to emphasize, at least in my view, norms are not something that just evolve voluntarily. norms are imposed, and liberal norms are imposed. Now, we may like them better and not think that they're imposed, but, you know, when the Russians say, if Russians say, who are you to say what the norms are? The answer is no one is to say what the norms are, but there's going to be either our norms or your norms, and we like our norms better. And so that's, you know, I want to leave you with a thought that is very important in my understanding of the world. There's no such thing as justice in the international system. There really is only who is on top. And that's a really ugly thought for Americans in particular, because that's not the way we like to think about the world, but in the international system, that's the case. I've strayed a little bit from your question. I mean, I feel like we are entering obviously a new era of warfare. And there's, of course, the warfare on the military side, where artificial intelligence is going to raise real questions about moral behavior. You know, if you basically have a computer deciding what targets to hit, and engaging in a way with other computers in a battle, and you sort of remove the human element, that raises moral questions that I myself have not yet figured out how to grapple with. Now, as far as cyber warfare, I don't consider cyber warfare of a physical variety to be qualitatively different from any other kind of warfare. If you could take out somebody's banking system with cyber warfare, you could also take it out with a nuclear weapon. And, you know, it may be better to take it out with cyber warfare, but that's not fundamentally different. So the only other area that's new and interesting, although it's not really new, is cyber information warfare, which we're seeing right now. But again, to me, that's sort of like we've gone back to Medici Florence, when there also was no such thing as the truth and a newspaper, and there was no place to go for news, and everything was rumor, and the rumors were false, and people were saying Lorenzo just gave birth to a child out of wedlock, or, you know, or somebody got poisoned in the church, and it was either true or not true. So that I mean, we're in a much more sophisticated version of that, and I very much worry about where that's taking us, including for our democracy. But it's a place that we've been before, but not with a democracy. So that's I mean, all these, I'm not sure exactly, I'm sure I didn't really answer your question, but those are the thoughts that your question inspired. So.
Excellent. Please join me in thinking about once again.